Hello! Thank you so much for checking out this video. This is the second video in my Maya for Beginners series of videos, and today I'm going to show you what can you do with object pivot. You learn everything you need to know: how to move it, how to rotate it, and how to snap it to different surface. I'll talk in more details about snapping. If you remember, we briefly looked at those icons in previous video, and today I'm going to show you how to use hotkeys, and we'll look through all of these tools once again and check all the settings they have, and I'll show you a few more interesting things. So yeah, let's get started. Everything you can select in Maya will have pivot, and pivot will allow you to move, scale, rotate your objects or object components. When I select different objects, default pivot will be placed exactly in the middle of every object. If I select a number of objects at once, you'll see that default pivot will be in the middle of the last selected object. If you want to move your pivot, all you need to do is click and hold D, and you will see it gives you a little highlighted area, like a rounded, and while you're holding it, you can move your pivot just exactly the same way like you would normally move your object, just like that. And when you release D on your keyboard, and everything will go back to normal, so you can just move your object again, just like that. But you will notice that your pivot now shifted will be somewhere else, and it's easier to see if you will try to rotate your object. You see, now you rotate it around your new pivot, which used to be in the middle. And if you want to place your pivot back to where it was in the center of your object, there's a useful hotkey you can use. Hold D and click right mouse button, and it will give you a marking menu for lots of things you can do with pivot. One of them would be reset pivot here. So if I move my mouse here and release it, I'll get pivot back to where it was. Okay, let's do a small exercise. Let's say I want to move that cube to the edge of that shape and be able to rotate it around the edge. So how would I do that? First, I would need to select my cube and move my pivot to that edge. Then I can snap my object to the edge of this object. And after that, I should be able to rotate it. First of all, we should learn how to snap pivot. When you hold D, if I select this object and hold D, and when I move my cursor around the object, I can notice sometimes it say align, which means it will snap my pivot to one of the components that is currently highlighted. So let's try it. We can snap my pivot to the face. We can snap pivot to vertices, and we can also snap it to the edge. Now I have my pivot in the right place. I need to find a way to snap it to the edge. This is not as hard as you can think. Remember, we were talking about snapping, and this one represents snap to grid. This one it's snap to curve, but also it will snap to edges of any object. And this one would snap to vertices. And one of the ways to temporarily activate them would be to use hotkeys. To snap to the grid, that one, you can use hotkey X. You can click and hold it, and you will see this icon highlighted. When I release it, it's to be not highlighted. So basically what it does, it temporarily activates snapping options in Maya while you're holding it. And if you click and hold X, and then you use middle mouse button, and you click and hold middle mouse button around and move your mouse around the area where you want to snap it on the grid. For example, I want to snap it, so I would click and hold it and move it. and I got snap. Click and hold and move. And if I keep moving with middle mouse button, it will move my object and it will snap to grid while I also holding X. If I highlight a little square in the middle, then I can move my object as long as I hold X. I can move it to any direction. If I highlight only one arrow, for example, this one, so I click and hold X again, you will only move it within this axis. And you can do the same if you want to snap to the curves or to the edges. The hotkey for that would be C. First, I select my middle square because I don't want to have any restrictions in the movement of my cube. Then I click and hold C, and I use middle mouse button again. Click and hold around that edge. I want, no matter where I move my mouse, it stick to that edge. And now I placed it just where I want it to be. And if I try to rotate it, yep, I can rotate it while it placed on the edge I wanted. And now let's try to snap it to one vertex. For example, this one. I will select my cube. I just isolate select this one. I'll hold D and I'll click with left mouse button. I will align it. And now let's remove isolate selection. Now we'll highlight the middle because I want to move it along all the axes. So I highlight that first, then I click and hold V on the keyboard. I'll place my cursor on top of that vertex, click and hold middle mouse button and move a little bit. Ta-da! See, now I snapped the cube. Okay, let's quickly summarize everything. So to snap to grid, we will use X. To snap to a curve or an edge, use C. To snap to a vertex, you will use V. And the way it works, first you need to click and hold your hotkey for snapping. For example, I want to snap to the grid. Then I need to select whether I want to move my object within one axis or within all of them. So for example, now I will move only within axis Y. Click and hold X, then click and hold middle mouse button and click anywhere on the grid. I will only move it along the axis I selected and snap it to the grid. There's something to be aware of. Sometimes when you have slightly wrong angle from your camera view, it might not work straight away. For example, I'm holding X and I'm trying to snap to the grid, and I think I'm clicking on the grid, but nothing happens. I think it's because my grid in a perspective view. What you can do in this case, you can just move your camera a little bit and then do it again, and you see now it works. A different angle of view from your camera can fix that. Now let's talk about pivot orientation and what settings do we have that might be useful. So you notice, although I moved and snapped my pivot to that vertex, my pivot still, the arrows of my pivot still have this angle, and this is exactly the same angle like you can see here, and it means that I have world orientation for my pivot. And that might be confusing, and it's quite hard to explain. For example, when you create a new object in Maya, it will always have a world orientation pivot. Those three axes will be always pointing to those three directions, and they will also be aligned with the grid. And for example, if I rotated something like 60 degrees or so, and switch back to move tool, I see you can see my the orientation of my pivot is exactly the same like it was before. This is something I can change if I go to tool settings and the first thing you see, it says axis orientation and it says world. So if I change it into object, now the arrow will show the direction that my object is facing. It's pointing out to direction that looks more natural to the object itself. I'll go back to axis orientation and all those settings you see here just a little bit later today. And let's see how snapping works when we are in a component mode. For example, let's select this object. Right mouse button will move to edges, and I select edge. If I want to move this edge along the other edge, this one for example, I can hold D and align it to this edge, and now I move it in the direction of this edge. And actually, let's keep our tool settings open, so we'll see what happens with axis orientation when we do that. Let's do it again. I'll select the edge, and currently my axis orientation says object. I'll click and hold D, and I'll align it to another edge, and I would switch my axis orientation to custom, which means it would now my pivot is not only positioned to the edge but also have orientation of the edge. In the settings you can see there is I have two ticks here, position and orientation. Okay, if I select this edge and I'll hold D and I'll align to the vertex. Yeah, that's a good one. You see it also changed the orientation, and now it has the orientation of pivot is based on that vertex I selected. I'll click Ctrl Z and unchecked orientation, hold D, do it again, and now the orientation of my pivot exactly the same as it was on when it was on this edge. Something else I can do, I can uncheck position and select orientation instead. And now when I hold D, let me just get it right. And now when I hold D and I click here, you see my pivot won't move, but it will change it into custom orientation based on that vertex I selected. So those two settings could be quite useful. And the way you can snap edges, vertices or faces when you are in a component mode is pretty much exactly the same like you snap things in object mode. Let me show you. For example, I want that edge and move it to the level of that edge. So I select that cube, go to edge mode, select edge. Currently I got my axis orientation as an object, and I have position and orientation switched on. I select the axis Y, this one, so I only want to move it on that side. Then I hold C, and with middle mouse button I'm selecting the area here, and you see it moved. It would match that level of that edge. And basically the same with everything else. Oh, the other thing, it's quite useful. You know how you can snap your object to vertices, for example. Let's go back to object mode and make it really tiny so it will be easier to show. So now if I select the middle square in the middle and click and hold C, I can snap it to different vertices, but there is also a way to snap it to the middle of any polygon. And to do that you need to select your this cube, second cube, go to display, polygons, face center, and now Maya displays you extra vertices in the perfect center of every face. And now I can move that cube with snapping to vertices with the middle mouse button, and I can snap it to the center. There's other ways in Maya to use snapping or align objects together, and I'll show them to you in my next video. Okay, let's continue and let's see what pin component pivot does. For example, let's go to this object and switch to faces. By default, when I select any components, you see it highlights pivot for that component. Or if I select multiple components, Maya will place pivot in the middle of all the selected components. Sometimes you might need to pin your pivot to one of the components and still be able to select the rest without moving your pivot. So if I want to move my pivot and pin it on the top of this sphere, I need to check pin component pivot. Then I click and hold D, I'll align it, and now I can select faces without moving my pivot. And when you want to have your pivot back, you can uncheck pin component, and now everything works the same way as it used to before. And now let's go back to object mode again. For example, if I select this object, I hold D and I align pivot with this face. And then I select another object and I go back to that object. I still have the same pivot at the same place. But if I hold D and I change orientation of my pivot and select this object and go back, it will reset my pivot orientation back to how it was before. If I don't want that happens, I can bake pivot orientation. So if I check this option, and now if I hold D and I move my pivot somewhere, I move my pivot somehow, I don't know, maybe like that. I select other object and go back, and you see, and the orientation of my pivot will be exactly the same as I left it. The next settings is show orientation handle. I would recommend just always keep it on. When I click and hold D and want to move my pivot, I can also rotate it. If I switch it off, when I click and hold D, it won't show me the handles for rotation. I don't think it's useful, so I will just keep it on. If I close tool settings and you want to have a quick access to tool settings, you can hold Command Shift and right mouse button, and you'll see this pop-up menu, marking menu, where you will find all the settings from a tool menu. For example, you can quickly change axis orientation from object, component, world. And there's also normal and parent that I'll show you a little bit later. And when you select object, click and hold D with right mouse button. You can also reset pivot orientation or reset pivot position. For example, if I move my pivot, or if I change orientation of my pivot. Let's go back to tool settings. The next setting is pivot reset. Could be center pivot and zero pivot. Usually you would use center pivot, and a zero pivot would place your pivot in the middle of the world, but only after you freeze transformation on your object. If you select this object, and because I will moving it around, you will see in the channel box, I'll have different numbers, translate and rotate. You will change its position, and the number will show that the current position, it's different from where it was when I just created it. So if I want to freeze transformation, basically it would erase all these numbers, and now this would be the original place of my object in the scene. Let me show you. You go to modify and you click freeze transformation. All these numbers got 0 and scale was reset to 1. This is something you can do when you want to export your object and you want to be sure that the object will be at the same position and with the accurate scale. So after that, for example, if I move my pivot somewhere here, and I'll choose a center pivot for pivot reset, and I hold D and right mouse button and click reset pivot, I will get pivot back in the middle. And now if I move my pivot again and I choose 0 pivot, watch what happens. I'm pressing D, right mouse button, and I click reset pivot. And you see pivot goes back to the 0, 0 point of the origin of the world. Now let's go to a component mode again. We'll switch to edges. The next one is transform constraints. By default, it's off, and we can use edge constraint or surface constraint. Let's try with edge. Now when I select edge, you see I have a little icon saying slide. So I can only slide edges along the others. And let me show you the hotkey for it. So I just switch it off back. If I move it while holding Control Shift, it will do the same. It will allow me to only slice edges with constraint of the other edges. And the same with vertices. If I select vertex, I can move it anywhere I want. If I hold Control Shift, now I can only slide it on the edges that is already here. And faces, Control Shift. It's a little bit less intuitive with the faces, but basically it does the same. It's a slide face based on the edges that is already here. For the surface, for example, I select this vertex and I click and move it, so I can move it freely to different directions. And if I choose surface, I won't be able to move it outside all of those surface, so I'll only able to move it along this surface, or along this surface, and this surface, and this surface. But I won't be able to move it to, for example, that direction or that direction, because it will keep this constraint of the faces that I have around it. And step snap, it's something I have showed you before. Every time I move something, it could be component or an object, it will snap to every unit. For example, this cube has a scale of 1 unit, and I have my step snap to 1. Each time I move it, I basically move the same size of the cube. You see? I'll switch it off. And to temporarily activate it, you can click and hold letter G and watch what happens here. You see, while I'm holding it, it switches step snap back to relative 1. And if I try to move, I'll have the same result. When I release, I don't have step snap settings on, so now I can move it as it used to be. The next set of settings, it's join orient settings. I'm not going to talk about it in this series of video because it's all related to animations and rigging. It's something I'm not going to cover in my beginners tutorials. Move snap settings. When I will show you how to work with live objects and do topology, I will go back to it. I don't think we need them right now. And this is something I already showed in my previous video a little bit. There is different ways you can select components. For example, I have go to faces. At the moment, to select faces, I need to click on every face. If I swap it to drag, then I can select faces like that. There is also a way to do it by holding tab, and again it will temporarily activate that option to drag and select faces. And the next settings is a camera-based selection and automatic camera-based selection. I showed it in a previous video very briefly. Let me repeat myself. When you have camera-based selection switched off and you click and drag, you will select through the object. If you have camera-based selection on and you click and drag, you will only select the components that are visible through your current camera view. They also have automatic camera-based selection. If I click it, I click and hold and I will select only camera-based, only components that are visible from my camera. If I go to wireframe mode and I click and drag, then I'll select through the whole object like that. It's the same way like you select polygons in Blender by default. I think I usually prefer to have it switched off, so when I select something, I select through geometry. And the next settings you can see here, it's highlight back faces. For example, I have this object and it has a hole. It means that all that faces I can also see from inside of the object. And when I move my cursor on top of them, I see a little bit of highlighting. If I switch it off, you'll stop highlighting back faces. So those faces inside your model are called back faces. So the next two settings, I think I'm going to skip them because I don't actually know exactly what they do. Based on my handbook, if I switch it off, it's supposed to stop highlighting faces or other components when I move my cursor, but I don't see it happen. So if you know what they do, write me a comment. I would really like to learn it. There is another setting I actually missed. It's a tweak mode. It can be useful if you really miss Blender. This is for you. What it does when you activate it and you use move, scale, or rotate, you can click, hold, and move your object straight away. You don't need to pre-select it, just like that. The same with scale, the same with rotate. If you want to move it along specific axis, you can use different views from your orthographic cameras. For example, if I go to top view and I start rotating objects, it'll only rotate it within top view, and the rotation in the tweak mode works based on camera. It will be the same like if I don't have tweak mode and I move it along camera-based view rotation. Let's move to selection constraint, and this is something quite interesting. When you select edges or faces, you can also select edge loops or edge rings. So if I switch to edge loop, and you see I move my cursor and I will only select edge loops. However, there is other way to select only edge loops. Double click with left mouse button. So for example, if I want to select that edge loop, I'll double click on the edge, or if I want to select that edge loop, I'll double click on the edge, it will select it. You can also select edge rings. Let me show it here, edge ring. Let me show you on this one. Going back to edge mode. So I can only select edge rings like that. And also, if I select one edge and then hold shift and double click on the next edge, it will select edge ring without using constraint. This is a very, very useful hotkeys. So I can do vertical edge rings or horizontal edge rings, vertical edge loops or horizontal edge loops. And if you want to select a multiple edge loops, just hold shift. Like you select one, then hold shift, select another one, select another one. And if you want to select just a part of edge loop, you can select one edge, click and hold Control Shift, and select the last edge. And you see, you select only that area of the edge ring. And the same for the edge loop. If you select one edge, then with shift you select the second edge, and then you go, for example, I only want to select that area. I can click Control Shift, double click, and I will select only part of the edge loop. So Edge loop and edge ring, I never use it from that menu because it's much easier to use hotkeys. Border edge, it's let's go there, go to edge. If I select border edge, I can only select border edges now. So when I move my cursor around, you see it's only highlight the border edge. The way to select border edge without using selection constraints, by double click on one of the edge and will highlight and select all the edge. For UV edge loop, I will talk about it when I will talk about UV. For the shell, it's when you have multiple objects combined in one object. I have this 3 sphere and I will combine them. When I combine it, technically I have just one object now. Because their geometry is not connecting to each other, when I go to face mode, I can double click and I can select all the connected meshes within one object, which is every shell separately, or I can use that selection constraint and it will only highlight me the shelves. Okay, let's look at the last one. Is a selection constraint by angle. Angle is actually more useful than the rest because there is no specific hotkey you can use for switching on and off. It will allow you to select multiple components based on how flat the surface. If you look at this object, because it's all rounded and it doesn't have a perfect flat surface, may using 15 degree as a threshold to show me flat faces. So if faces is not perfectly flat, as long as they within 15 degree, I will select them. Let's change it into 45 degree. Now it's much larger because I would use my 45 degree as a threshold. And the same with vertices. And exactly the same with the edges. This can be very useful when you need to work with a high density mesh and you can't possibly select one by one, or lasso selection wouldn't select all the faces you need. So in which case you can use selection constraint with angle. And let's move to the next one, soft selection. And as you could probably guess already, there will be a hotkey you can use. Let's start by enabling it here. I'll use that high density plane and go interface mode. You see now my cursor looks different. And the first thing I can do, I can change fill of radius to something like smaller. And if I switch soft select off, you'll see actually we only selected one face. So there's only one face selected. I switch soft select on, and now if I move this face, you'll see everything moves and everything has a nice smooth transaction. The hotkey to switch soft select on and on is B. You see, if I click B, it's switched on and it's switched off. So now soft select is off, and I do the same, and I only move one face. Now so soft select mode is on, and I move this face together with all the surrounded faces. To change the allow of radius, you can click and hold B, and you can use middle mouse button and just click and drag, and you can change the radius. If you notice, when I did that, it resetted the radius back to 0. So I hold B, I click middle mouse button, and I start from the top. However, if I hold B and click and hold left mouse button, I can change the radius, but it will start from the current radius. So you see, I can just make it slightly smaller or slightly larger. We'll come back to follow mode in a minute. Let's quickly talk about follow curve. This curve will show you how different intensity will apply to different area within that radius. and you can change it from curve presets. For example, if I choose this one, and now if I move it, it's going to move it according to that new curve that I selected. Then if I select another face, and I will choose this one, I'll try to move it. Now it moves accordingly to that new curve. You can also change it yourself. If you click on any areas of the curve, it will create a point, and you can choose between a smooth, linear, or spline interpolation. And if you want to delete one point, you just hold Command and click here. The next settings is viewport color. It's just showing you that you currently have soft selection on. It's very useful to keep it on because it can be very confusing when you think you don't know you're in a soft select mode and you start moving something and it moves together with the other objects or other areas of your mesh. And if you want, you can also change color if for some reason you prefer a different gradient. And now let's talk about fall-off mode. And I have just made this very strange shape. So for example, I want to change this part of my model, and I'm thinking that using soft selection would be the best way to do that, because what I want a nice and smooth area here. Let's try. I will go into face mode, select it, switch to scale, and right now I can see axis orientation is slightly wrong. So what I can do, I can use component axis orientation, and now I can scale it according to the component. So I'm trying to scale it, and I can notice that it also takes another part of the mesh, which I don't want. That's why in a soft selection you have different fall-off modes. If I switch from volume to surface, you see what happens. It will use topology of my model and will just go down based on topology. So now I can scale that face and get the result I want. And the next fall-off mode is global. If I switch back to volume and select, for example, this face, and I'll move my fall-off radius, and you see it only affects my current selected object. So this other one, it's a different object. So this is one object and this is another object. If I select the same face and from volume change to global, it will also affect other objects in the same area. So now if I will move this face, it will not only affect the current object, but also anything else within that area which even not the same object. And let's check the last one. So now I have that set of objects, and I will select this object. I will select these two faces, for example, here. Switch on my soft selection in a global, and while I'm in a global settings, I'll click and drag, so going to be really large. So I wanted my soft select radius affect all the objects, and now if I move it, you see what happens. All the objects get some sort of distortion. I'll show you. But if I move it to object, soft select would work slightly different in this mode. You can notice that gradient is gone and every next object would have slightly different color. It is just a flat color. And now if I move my object, it doesn't distort the other objects that much. Since they're all in the same radius, they're also affected by the movement, but without that distortions that we had before in a global. And let's quickly talk about symmetry. So let's switch our symmetry on and try world X symmetry. Now go to H mode, and Maya highlights all the edges on the right and on the left. The reason it works because it's a world symmetry. It's because my object is placed in the middle of our 3D space, in the middle of the grid, and see what happens if I move it. For example, here, and I go back to H mode, and now I don't have the symmetry anymore. So now I need to switch to object S to get the same result. And when I switch to object X, Maya will look at the object and the object pivot in center. So it will know where exactly the center of my symmetry now. Before that, the center of symmetry was our world 000, which is here. And now our center of symmetry is middle of object. And now let's do something else. Let's go back to object mode and rotate our object like that. And we go in modify, freeze transformation. And now I just freeze transformation for my object, and Maya doesn't know what original orientation it was. It just used vert orientation as a default orientation, pivot orientation for my object. Now if I go back to H mode, despite I have object X symmetry, I don't have any highlights here, and now I can still recover my symmetry if I go to if I switch back to object mode and I'll go to symmetry, topology. Maya ask me to select the edge that is in the middle, so it will know where is the middle of my model. I'll select this edge, and now I go to the edges, H mode, and look what happens. Now I got my symmetry back, even though I have reset pivot of my object, and I couldn't get symmetry works in other settings like world or object. And those are good settings for symmetry is tolerance. If you're using this topology symmetry and your object isn't perfectly symmetrical, and you can see that it doesn't work perfectly, you can try use tolerance slider and just have higher tolerance, and it will select other components on other side of your symmetry edge, even if they're not perfectly symmetrical. And the very last settings, it's shift and drag settings. In Maya you can create duplicates or extrude components if you use shift and move tool. For example, if I click and hold shift and I move my object, it will create a duplicate. And if I select faces and let's change the orientation to component, and if I select a few faces and I hold shift and I move them, you see I got extrude. If for some reason you don't like it, you can switch those two settings off. And geometry type, I'm probably going to explain it much better in my next video when I will talk about how I duplicate different objects. But let me show you. While geometry type is copy, I do a copy, and this one I change geometry type into instance, and I do instance. So I go back to this object, select a few faces, and up, and extrude them. Other object look exactly the same as it was before. And now if I select this object, few faces, you see, because it's instance, it works together, and everything you do with this object would also happens to your duplicate. So now if I do extrude, it will also do the same for this object. And now let's look at some of the settings for rotation tool and scale tool that only relevant to those two tools. So let's start with rotate tool. When you have multiple objects, for example, I'll select all of this. The last selected object by default will have pivot, and if I try to rotate it, every object will rotate around their own pivot or middle point. And if you want to rotate all the objects together in a slightly different way, there is options you can use in the tool settings. It calls rotate center, and by default it's in the middle. But if we switch it to manip, then you see what happens when I rotate. All the objects will be rotating around this middle pivot point of the last selected object. And if I click selection, it will use all the selected objects as a one and create pivot in the middle of all of them. So now if I rotate them, I'll rotate all of them around their middle point. And there's something to be aware of. If you select one object, for example this one, and move pivot somewhere, let's say here. And now when you select all the objects again and you move them using default or object rotate center, you see what happens. If object has pivot somewhere else, it will start rotating around that pivot, not in the middle of itself like the other objects, because the other objects have pivot in the middle of every object. And for the scale tool, all the settings exactly the same like in move tool. We already know how they work, but there is one that is slightly different. It's called prevent negative scale. I have just selected this H loop, and if I want to straighten it, I will just click and drag this axis, and you see when you reach the middle it won't go any further into negative space. If I switch it off and I click and drag, and yeah, as you can see, I'll scale it even further than 0. And the last thing, when you have shape like that and you want to make it thicker or thinner, and you think you go into faces and you select all the faces and try to scale them, but what happens, you just scale your object and you can switch axis orientation into normal and try again, but it won't work. It will do exactly the same. To make it work, go back to move tool and select all the vertices. It only works with vertices, and switch axis orientation into normal. I'll have this little arrow here pointing to N, and I can use it to make it thicker or thinner. Okay, I think this is enough for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope it was useful and you learned something. Give me a like or subscribe if you want to see more. And yeah, thanks for watching, and see you in my next video.